everybody. I'm looking forward to today and the discussion after the presentation too, to kind of hear all of your feedback there. So I'm kind of toggling between Zoom and my own PowerPoint. So, but I would love, as I can see your faces, if you have any, I want to try to read the room. And if I need to clarify something or reiterate something, I'm going to try to do that. If I miss something, then let's get to that at the end. So I'll do my best. You know, we all know Zoom is a little tricky to presenting. So I appreciate your video being on so I can at least see some of your facial expressions. Okay, so the title of this talk is The Drama Triangle and the Power and Control Wheel Walk into a Church. So this is my kind of, I've been kind of focused on the drama triangle the past few years, and that there's just so much relatability with religious trauma and high control groups. And so I'm essentially gonna talk about what the drama triangle is, talk a little bit about the power and control wheel and kind of how that looks with some of our population that we work with. So using those two frameworks clinically. So the drama triangle is a model, a conceptual model that came out of transactional analysis, which was created by Eric Berney back in 1964 from a book, which I really like the title, Games People Play, The Psychology of Human Relationships. And so one of his mentees, Stephen Karpman, built upon those ideas, essentially, which were how people travel around in different roles and relationships. And so Stephen Karpman came up with the concept of the drama triangle to build upon that. And so what is the drama triangle? It's essentially, the drama triangle is a triangle, so you can kind of imagine it in your mind. It doesn't really matter where the roles are, top, bottom, but it's a triangle with three different archetypal roles, including the victim, the persecutor or the perpetrator, and the rescuer, otherwise known as the martyr or the caretaker, where people acting out of these three different roles are kind of trapped in conflict without any resolution. So staying in these roles sustains a dysfunctional system, be it a family, a religious organization, an academic department, a sports team, really anything. The roles create an unhealthy interdependence. So the persecutor needs a victim to persecute. The rescuer needs someone to come in and caretake, to rescue. The victim needs somebody to blame, and so, or the victim needs someone to rescue them, I should say, and so forth. And so some people have kind of a preferred role, if you will, that they camp out in frequently. Most of the time, people in these dysfunctional roles will kind of bounce around from one role to another, but they remain trapped on that triangle. This can happen with any number of people, and we'll get to that a little bit. Although there are three roles, it could be two people, it could be a mother and a daughter, it could be two partners in a couple relationship. So I'm going to give you an example of what being on this drama triangle might look like. So let's say teenage son wrecks the car, so dad says to the son, you wrecked the car again, what's wrong with you? You're good for nothing. So he's in the persecutor role. The son kind of goes into the victim role saying, it wasn't my fault. I was going through a hard time and I was distracted and I missed the red light. Like, not my fault. Mom comes in as the rescuer. Poor thing, honey, we totally understand. We'll buy you a new car. We're just going to pacify and make everything okay. The dad persecutes again. Poor thing, what's wrong with you? So now he's victimizing the mom. The mom shifts from rescuer to persecutor and says, well, to the dad, if you weren't so hard on him all the time, maybe he would be a better driver. Well, now the son, who had originally been victimized, pops into the the rescuer role and says, Mom, don't be so hard on dad. He can't help it. So then the dad, who was a persecutor, now is a victim and says, she's always hard on me. I don't know what I ever did to deserve this. So as you can see, they're just kind of trapped in this triangle. So what's missing on the triangle? There is no accountability, there are no boundaries. Although there are feelings, there are not feelings with vulnerability. The dad is mad, that the kid wrecked the car, and instead of owning it, the dad just kind of perpetrates on the kid, just is by insulting him. So many things are missing here. So what might this look like in a church or religious or any kind of high control environment? So let's say in a traditional church setting where there are very traditional roles, pastor is often a male. Let's say pastor has an affair with a female parishioner, makes an apology to the church. I've sinned, I'm just a sinner saved by grace. Look at me, I'm a victim, essentially. I live in a world of temptations. Essentially, I'm a victim of my flesh. Nothing is my fault. I am so sorry for what I've done. So you don't really hear any accountability in this statement. So you can see he has perpetrated by having an affair, breaking the rules, that's like not allowed in those cultures, right? Not to mention it's with a church member. So he's abusing his power and taking advantage of somebody potentially vulnerable, which we'll get to that power dynamic here in a few minutes. And he goes into the victim role with his apology. And so the church kind of collectively goes into a rescuer role. God has forgiven him and we will too. It's the right thing to do. He made a mistake. That's kind of a buzzword that people use a lot, groups use a lot to kind of erase, their leaders when they do something out of line or something wrong. So praise God for God's forgiveness, like basically we support the pastor and he can do no wrong. The actual victim, the person that engaged, that he had the affair with, carries all of the shame, potentially self-polices through an internalized drama triangle. Self-talk might look like rhetoric given by the group. So for example, in groups like this, sometimes women are looked at as temptresses. Maybe it was my fault. Maybe I was a temptress. I can't be trusted. There's a lot of gender stuff in there. I'm a horrible sinner, like thank God for God's grace kind of thing. And so you can see that these dynamics don't only occur at an individual level within a family, but they can happen at a collective level. And so at a macro level, this can happen in terms of purity culture. So I think a lot of us are familiar with the term purity culture and this whole idea that, this culture that hyper focuses on virginity, involves a collective policing of people's dress, attitudes, behaviors, collective shame and humiliation heaped on anyone who doesn't comply with the rules of purity culture. There's messages like boys will be boys, sex creates a soul tie that binds one to their partner forever. These are some of the kind of messages that people hear that promote shame and fear, and sustain a larger culture, which is part of that drama triangle as persecutory. So let's say someone in an accountability group, which those of us in the cult land, cult studies know that those accountability groups and confession groups are an additional control tactic by high control groups. So let's say someone in an accountability group confesses, oh, I had sex with my boyfriend. I feel so guilty. I'm so ashamed. It just happened. We didn't mean to. The group might collectively support the member by praying for strength not to give in to temptation next time, thereby reinforcing this message espoused by purity culture. Not to mention that that person may or may not have ever been able to consent to this belief system that espouses purity culture. They might have been born into it. They might have, just been in it for so long that it feels like truth. It feels like the right thing to them. And so they might not have had a chance to consent to an ideology that really goes against their own biology. So essentially purity culture becomes the persecutor with its web of messages, and then groups at high level can sustain that. So you can imagine how larger groups of people, whether it's particular genders, people that are high up politically in the group, the ones with money and social privilege, can collectively endorse that power and control. And when they're in that persecutory role, it's just completely chaotic. And you can imagine too that people can collectively be victims of this, whether it's women, BIPOC individuals, LGBTQAI individuals, people that have different ability statuses, really any marginalized population, as they can be stripped of power and dignity, or maybe not even stripped of it. They maybe never were able to have it in that group due to the high level of control. So those are just a couple of examples of what this can look like on a macro level. And so we can also take it down to a micro level. So in high control groups, the roles of persecutor, victim, and rescuer can be so ingrained that people internalize them. To the point that they're policing themselves to keep themselves in line with the group's wishes. So this can look like self-gaslighting. So here's an example. If I don't pay my tithes to the church or the group, I might feel guilty. So to avoid this guilt, I'll do what I need to do to get my tithe paid, perhaps paying more than I can afford and giving up some basic needs. And so I'm victimizing myself by, shaming myself to take care of the church or the group in a way that is self-persecutory and self-shaming. So I am the victim, I am the persecutor, and I am the rescuer all at once in this scenario. Lots of chaos internally when this happens, and unfortunately, this can be thought of as a tactic of high control groups. It's, we know with cult studies that there's often sort of messages that are high control that are touted from the front or the top leadership, and people internalize them. And then it's almost like the leaders don't have to do a whole lot to keep people in line. People will keep themselves in line. And this is the drama triangle, just kind of a conceptualization through which to consider what that might look like. So why do people travel on this triangle? What does it do for people? Well, it really, although it's void of resolution and it's full of chaos, it does help people to avoid their feelings, especially uncomfortable feelings. It helps people to avoid accountability. It helps people to maintain an illusion of connection, even if it's disjointed and not a very vulnerable connection. At least I'm tied to someone, even if it's dysfunctional. It also helps people to resolve their own cognitive dissonance. So it allows you cognitively to fill in the narrative of the story. So let's say I can't deal with my pastor, my beloved pastor who I look up to, having an affair. So I'll write a narrative in my head that makes it okay. I will rescue that person, at least mentally in my head, to kind of minimize and help him not to have any accountability for what's going on, because I struggle to resolve that cognitive dissonance that someone that has done something hypocritical to what they teach or preach. So why do we do this? Sometimes we're born into it, whether we're born into a family that kind of travels around this triangle, or born into a high control group that travels around this triangle. Sometimes it's really the only way we know how to relate to others. So if our own individual identities have never really been nurtured or fostered, then we're inextricably entangled with others on this triangle. And it's not always by our choice. Even the other day, a client of mine said to me, they said, I don't even know how to have a relationship off of this triangle. And so our therapeutic relationship is something we talk about, our own relationship and how you know, that person sometimes has an urge to like keep coming, even if they don't need to come anymore, or to invite me to a social event. And it's really neat that we get to talk about that. And most recently, we reflected at the end of the session.
I really don't know.
Oh, did someone say something?
I know.
Okay. Sorry. If you could put your camera on mute, or your audio on mute. I just make sure there's not distractions. Yeah, so at the end of a recent session where we're like titrating down, we really got to have this neat moment commenting on, it's really sad that we're not going to get to see each other as much, and it just feels really appropriate because this is what a boundaried, safe relationship looks like. We're off the triangle. No one's persecuting, no one's a victim, no one's rescuing, you know. So what I've noticed in cults and high control groups is that people become so familiar with the roles, because that's where they live essentially, that they forget, or perhaps sometimes have never learned, if they were born into the abusive system or dysfunctional system, they don't know how to operate outside of these roles. So even years after deprogramming or deconstructing, people have remnants left of these roles. And sometimes this kind of catches years later, you know. I often see this specifically with caretaking behaviors. A lot of people in high control evangelicalism, which is what I kind of specialize in, have a lot of a pull to be rescuers, you know. So even years later, I see them caretaking. They don't want someone to look bad, you know. You'll hear phrases like, oh, they mean well, or they weren't all that bad, you know, look, their heart was right, their heart was in the right place, even if they were doing something destructive. And that may speak to echoes of that caretaker or rescue role that they've embodied, really to survive the group that they've come out of. So you can think of this as also a survival skill. So to maintain connection, I have to be on this triangle to survive, to stay in the group. Because if I don't show up in this way, then I might be ousted, I might be shunned. And that is so existentially terrifying that, okay, I'll, you know, give up my own personal needs and kind of be in a rescuer role or whatnot. And so when that happens, when that manifests in session, it's clinical data that can be addressed, hopefully within the safety of the therapeutic relationship, you know, talking about, well, you know, if they kind of minimize someone's bad behavior, you know, what is that like? Do you really believe that they meant what does that mean to you, to sort of help them gain insight into that, and maybe question or challenge where that might have come from. Maybe it really isn't a big deal. Or maybe it is them kind of knee-jerk reaction going back to this drama triangle where they're minimizing their own needs and making okay something that somebody else has done or said, even though it's hurtful to them. Okay, so that's the drama triangle. So now insert the power and control wheel. And I guess I'll look for some nods. I know a lot of us are familiar with the power and control wheel. Okay, I'm seeing some nods. So I'm not going to go over it super specifically, other than kind of high level to share that this model was developed in the early 80s in Duluth, Minnesota. And it just outlines common tactics of abusers. And so the graphic is a wheel, you know, it's a circle, and in the middle is power and control. And there's 8 categories that are kind of used as tactics of power and control. So they include economic abuse, and you can relate this directly to religious power and control. So economic abuse, denying the victim to access to money, take it to a high control group or church, you know, you're shaming people to give money to the church or to the group. You know, encouraging people to believe in this idea of like this poverty gospel. You don't need anything, give all your money to God, and it's holy to live a life with very little and to be simple. You know, there's manipulation there. The high control group gets all the money and the person is denied savings and things that could help them later. Coercion, threats, like convincing a survivor to do something illegal, you know, example that came to mind was the NXIVM cult, where we know a lot of, it's not illegal to run a cult, but illegal activity is often where cults get busted, as has been the case with the NXIVM cult. The sex ring that they had in that cult, they essentially coerced people into engaging in sexual behavior in a way that perhaps without the brainwashing and manipulation, they wouldn't have participated in that. So using that coercion and those threats, intimidation, keeping the survivor fearful. So this is super on brand with high control religion, with, guilting people, shaming people, using fear-based tactics around eternal consequences, hell, that kind of thing, to kind of keep people in line with what the group wants. Emotional abuse, again, the self-gaslighting, making people feel like they are essentially worthless or that they're sinners or wretched, as a means to control them. Isolation is another one, directly related to religious abuse, when so when people are isolated from friends and family and their only social support lies within the group itself. And there are sometimes even messages around, oh, you don't want to, mingle with people outside of the group, you're unequally yoked, or, they load the language in that way to keep people only dependent on others in the group. So they're essentially isolating them. And then of course, in high control groups, people are often shunned if they do leave the group or get out. There's messages within the group about that person that has left, which just maintains the fear and shame and control of the system. Why would I leave? Because then everyone will talk about me and I'll have nobody. And so, yes, using other things like children. So in abusive relationships, using children to kind of control an ex-partner. Well, in high control groups, people use children as a means of control, whether that children are raised in a different area, if there's a compound that they're living on, whether it's, I've heard so much about messages around spanking, churches endorsing behaviors of spanking children and shaming parents if they don't agree with that. So those are the ways that the power and control concepts are relatable to religious power and control. And if anyone wants to look it up later, Laura Anderson from the Religious Trauma Institute has created a religious power and control wheel, and essentially takes the categories from the original wheel and kind of shifts them into examples that can be seen in high control religious groups. And so she has a website, traumaresolutionandrecovery.com. And if you look in the resources section, there's a whole bunch of great information there for you. Okay, so what we're really looking at is the intersection between the drama triangle and the power and control wheel. We really want to understand the control issues that are infused into the triangle. Okay, because then it's not just dysfunctional, it's not just that people are in dysfunctional roles, it's dysfunctional roles with abuses of power laced into that system. And so one thing I've noticed is that I call it triangles within triangles on the drama triangle. So what do I mean by this? So often leaders in this system are in a persecutory role, consciously or unconsciously employing minions around them to take care of them or rescue them. So this is where the power and control model and the drama triangle intersect. So for example, a pastor, in this example, is a persecutor, holds a position of power and influence in the church. It's important to acknowledge who or what has power within that system, like what genders, what people of financial influence, political power, or whatnot, and let that inform our understanding of how this kind of plays out. So back to that pastor, they might have sexist standards. There's my biases based on what I work with a lot. So let's say a fundamentalist Christian church believes the man is the head of the household. So the male pastor might influence or manipulate the upper level people at the leadership at the church into believing and doing certain things for the betterment of the church, whatever that might be, business deals, touting theology, whatever that might be. Well, the male pastor might influence the upper level leaders into believing or doing certain things. In that triangle, those other leaders might have little power other than to submit to or obey that pastor, or in other words, be in a caretaking or rescuing role. Well, then when those very people go home to their wives, because this is a whole nother talk, but it's a heterosexist culture. So they go home to their wives. They have ruling privileges over their wives and their children, because in this system, there's kind of a hierarchy of power and leadership. And so they're disempowered at church, but then they go home and they're empowered and emboldened by their pastor and their religious system to be in a position of power at home. So let's say the husband goes home, demands sex from his wife. The wife doesn't want to. She says no. Husband shames her, submit woman, like you have to do this, you have to submit to me. She gives in. So she's in kind of that caretaking role, and she feels bad about not wanting to please her husband in that way. So she gives in. And so she's victimized now, and then sort of rescues him. And you can even think about it as rescuing God, because the belief in that high control system is that this is what God has declared is correct, right? This is the right thing to do. So she's kind of stuck. Well, then how does this play out with her friends? She's a mentor in the group. So she talks about what it means to be a godly wife in the group. So she encourages other women in the group to submit to their husbands in the same way that she's submitted to hers. And so this trauma really just kind of gets played out and sustained, and it self-perpetuates. So from the macro level down to the micro level, it's just so heavy. It's just so thick on people. And that you can understand, that's why when people get out of these groups, it's like they, don't even know where to look, because they're just so entrenched in these patterns. Okay, so it is possible to show up differently. There is hope, so I think clinically I've found it to be really helpful to just explain these concepts to clients and help them think through, okay, how would you explain this story that you just told me on the drama triangle? Who was persecuting? Who was in the victim role, who was in the caretaker role, to get them kind of thinking about that. Well, then they'll often say, well, what do I do next? I don't know how to do relationships that are not on this triangle. And so some people have come up with sort of the solution, or another way to think about these roles, where the victim shifts into a creator role, the persecutor shifts into a challenger role, and the rescuer shifts into a coach role. So back to that situation I shared about the teenage kid crashing the car, the dad, instead of being a persecutor, might choose to say, instead of saying, you wrecked the car again, what's wrong with you? You're good for nothing. He might say, like, hey kid, I'm really angry that the car got wrecked. We're really struggling financially, but I am glad that you made it out okay. And then the son, instead of being defensive in a victim role, might say, thanks, Dad. I guess I've been a little distracted lately with everything that's been going on. I'll try to focus better the next time. And then the mom, instead of being a rescuer, if she were to show up in a coaching role, she might say, great idea, honey. What do you think would help to minimize the distractions while you're driving? So you can see, instead of being locked into this situation where it's chaotic and there's nowhere to go, there is accountability, there's connection, there's some moving forward with resolution there. And so I would be curious how you all can imagine this playing out, this dynamic playing out in a high control group, and kind of the other ways, the newer ways of showing up on this drama triangle. And I will look forward to hearing about that in our discussion.